All right, so thank you. Hannah's a landscape architecture academic, and I'll leave it to her to explain more.
Right. Kia ora Becky, kia ora koutou katoa, ko Hannah Hopewell aho, ko Ngāti Pākehā Tīti no Tamaki Makaurau aho. I'd like to acknowledge Becky and Regan and Catherine for all your mahi in putting this series together, and thank you all for tuning in. So I've been with Te Kura Wainga Wellington School of Architecture for about 3 years now. Here I mainly teach in landscape and also across the disciplines, both at undergraduate and postgraduate level. Now, I'm going to share my screen, and actually I'm going to do something which I don't normally do when I'm sort of giving these kind of formal-ish talks. And I'm going to talk a bit more about myself than I'm used to. So you can see all that? Is that all good? Yep. Okay, so there's a slightly protracted beginning to getting into the Porirua issue. So I'll be discussing Porirua and with what I'm calling its unmaking. But there's sort of two broad influences that I want to traverse to first. So I'll then share a few projects, and primarily these projects to contextualize or demonstrate my approach and the ensuing kind of rationale that I have in terms of the approach I take to the Porirua conversation. So the first influence is primarily vocational. Prior to university teaching, I trained and practiced in landscape architecture and then in urban design in Auckland. I was involved in a broad range of commercial and public projects that included really broad scope, from site design to infrastructure, schools, urban renewals, streetscapes, subdivisions, master plans, and even a few gardens. And also I worked in strategic spatial planning for a period. So in a way, I kind of, from a practice point of view, became something of a specialist generalist in quite a short space of time. Now, my second influence, and this is what I don't normally talk about, and I gloss over it as sort of inconsequential, but is that I was involved by marriage in international yacht racing for 2 decades. And that caused me to, or had the opportunity to live in many other countries, as well as travel frequently for extended periods. So a lot of my, 20 years of my life was spent kind of elsewhere or coming and going. And why this is kind of relevant here is that I spent a lot of time, mainly in waterfront cities, on my own. And this kind of suited me just kind of fine, given my curiosity in cities and urban landscapes. So that was kind of, quite consequential for me. So because over these couple of decades, these two sort of influences interwove, and I developed a practice that is in some ways analogous with Guy Debord's Derive, or the situationist kind of method. However, it differs significantly, given I'm not really interested in the production of psychogeography as prescribed by humanism, and I won't explain that now, that's for another day. And so I therefore think of this practice, this critical practice, as more kind of cultivated as an orientation, a kind of immersive hikoi, or orientation towards non-human and minor material processes, such as the incidental and the undefined, the micro and fluxes and flows, or the things that constitute what is often thought of the backdrop to urbanity. So in many ways, this kind of attunement to such things became kind of my hobby, really, for quite a long time. And I didn't quite realize how it was impacting my practice professionally. Sometimes I would document these kind of formally, or sometimes, with photographs or words, but often not, and just take the experience. So in a way, I mentioned these two things as I feel like I've got a fairly rich and diverse grounding in the many ways we can come to inhabit and read and understand cities and urban landscapes as lived and living material. So along with this awareness through such experience of the contingent factors and the temporalities and tendencies that urban spaces frequently demonstrate across a range of different minor and major scales. And perhaps this is these two interweavings is how I've come to see life in the dross as much as in the intentional. and why I've come to call and understand the city as a kind of body of bodies, both material and immaterial. So in many senses, what I'm throwing all these words at you, I'm composing a kind of frame, I guess, for how I see and compose knowledge on the city, and why I began to find it kind of difficult, or why my motivations started to diverge or became increasingly incompatible with the values of mainstream professional practice. This became more acutely evident when I was asked to work as a consultant on what was called Auckland Unleashed. That was the Auckland Plan back in 2010 and 11. Now, with this sort of significant restructuring, a tiny piece of background for those that are not familiar, Auckland was previously 9 cities, and around that time it was requested from a government directive to accommodate for growth, and at that same time it also amalgamated into one so-called super city. So I was quite excited by that proposition as the significant restructuring that was in play. I saw an opportunity to reimagine what a Pacific city could be like, how the distinctive spatialities and practices of the Pacific could emerge through the urban form, and also at various different scales. I was interested in the sorts of discourse that could be catalysed about how to grow a sense of space, the sense of space of commonality in that kind of realm. What I found, however, was the expected practice of urban design and spatial design planning, at least in my experience, was less to engage in forms of discovery of new ways of doing, and more to follow principles developed in old world cities. At this time, 2011, New Zealand was soliciting advice from newly imported urban designers, and have to say mainly in the shape of white English men, that in short, I personally found imperialistic. And so as a New Zealand trained urban designer, I was really keen to renew spatial discourse with a localised politic, but I found my voice somewhat marginal in that realm. However, I didn't mind the marginality, but what I did mind is the kind of lack of creativity, and I found it was a bit of a killer for me, and resulted in an orientation to how I practice. So that was a really long intro into that's a little bit of background about me and why I ended up here in academia, and why I've ended up doing the sorts of practice that I undertake. So this reorientation was kind of, I guess, formalised, by completing a PhD, a creative practice PhD in spatial design. And here I focused on the non-possessive space of the intertidal, and that is the space between the city and the sea. Now, I've always been drawn to the liminal, or the space and time bodies of the fringe. If I think about myself as a tiny child, I'd sit on the stoop that was, right at the front of my parents' villa, right on the street, that kind of liminal zone between, inside and out, or the muddy banks of Cox's Creek. And I've always been interested in the remnant and the vacant landscapes of sort of industrial areas, or the back ends of subdivisions, and in spaces outside the purview of primary gaze. So I seek out these spaces, and I term them the derealised. So the blatantly visible yet unseen, the kind of blind spots to city's discourse. And whilst this is slightly off tangent, I celebrate their ungovernability, their social potential, and kind of emergent social potential of these. But again, that's for another conversation. But again, very briefly, there's a politic to this orientation, and one that at root holds a resistance to the hegemony of modern epistemologies, which is most evidently observed via the possessive ethic that permeates city making and land development. So it kind of was the persistence of neo-colonial operations that I saw embedded in spatial planning that caused me to critically pursue alternative techniques of thought through my PhD. And my current work is grounded in I call a gemal ecology, and this draws also from new materialist and post-human ontologies, speculative aesthetics, feminist and queer approaches. So, really skimming over the surface here, but I want to sort of point out that I don't operate from any fixed positionality, but always situated in one way or another. And that depends on the occasion. So the doctorate experience really broadened how I used creative practice to investigate and respond to situated urban landscape concerns. And to that end, I've intentionally charted a course that appreciates multiple ways of knowing, or multiple ways of responding to encounter, and thus diverse ways of producing knowledge. So whilst I'm not so fond of labels, the experience and orientation points towards identification as a transdisciplinary researcher or practitioner, and trans meaning that which is at once between the disciplines and across the different disciplines and beyond all discipline. And yeah, there's more I could say about that. So I'll move on to a project that I was commissioned to do in 2011, becoming Tamaki Makaurau, Auckland. And that's the beautiful Te Pane o Maho there, Mount Margary. And yeah, tēnako I tamaki, tēnako, tamaki Makaurau rā I. That's a translated as greetings, o tamaki, greetings, greetings to thee, o tamaki of numerous lovers. Ngāti whātua toki there. And this particular project was primarily a written one, and my instigation, I was commissioned because I put my hand up for it, I guess, and it was a piece of writing was about 2,000 words, and this diagram, which you can, it's so old, you can perhaps read still some of it, and it was targeted at the internal mechanisms of Auckland Council and consultants working on the vast job that was the Auckland Plan and this new spatial planning. So I was motivated by a kind of void, I guess, about the ways with which we approach discourse. And so I kind of, played with language a bit with this idea of if we could understand Aucklandness, this quality of being, we might develop an Aucklandology, a kind of sum of knowledge-making processes, and that might move into an Aucklandism, sort of, more self-aware and confidently expressed and lived understanding of what Auckland is kind of made up from. So that piece of work ended up in, a document that was circulated, don't know what happened to it. But the last, I won't read, I might just read the last little bit of it. Going for time. Yes, okay, I'll just read a couple of sentences. So Auckland's challenge is to strengthen relationships with locally understood natural systems, the qualities of earth and water, so as to foster the kinds of resourceful, autonomous communities that are contingent to the future health of the people in place. The 21st century is the resilient bioregion with innovative global thinking and village values. Auckland is well positioned to lead change in becoming resiliently urban. Let's start with a new depth of conversation based upon values that emerge and are tested here in the Pacific, not imported and applied with limited criticality. So it's pretty clear what my point was there. This other project, which I'll go through quickly, was I was part of another internal project, and I was part of what was called the Urban Design Working Party, which was a group of representatives from the property development body, NZIA, New Zealand Planning, etc. And we worked on kind of projects, and this was one that, or a fragment of one I did. Essentially what it is a strategy looking at the kind of living framework across bluescape, landscape and urbanscape in Auckland, and trying to kind of develop a kind of more visibility or leverage to the kind of living matrix within which a city is formed. And one of the kind of key aspects of it really were edge conditions. And so I developed a matrix of anticipated edge conditions and design responses to those different edges as an overall kind of strategy. And that was particularly kind of critical given the rural-urban boundary concerns. So this, and the question of growth, where do we sort of cut growth off, and where do we keep it going? Where do we contain? So that was a kind of an interesting piece of work. This next one is something a little different. This was a project, an art gallery project. So it was an installation in the 2013 triennial in Auckland, the proposition being if you were to live here, and this project is called We Within Margins. And what I did was collect buckets of mud, or buckets of intertidal earth from all of these different locations here, and sew little kind of blankets for them, and invited people to participate in standing in the ones that they identified with. So what I was making here was a kind of visceral connection between, or making intimate the kind of reality of much of New Zealand's coast, Auckland's rather, coastline is made up of these kind of muddy intertidal margins. And, you know, we think of Auckland, we get the kind of sparkly Waitemata with its, you know, bay, rocky promontory form, and the beauty of the intertidal and the mangrove is often overlooked, not so much these days. But this was a really fun project to do, and it was fascinating to me how I saw, you know, grown men kind of become sort of quite childlike in this experience of stepping in the mud. What accompanied this project was a cycled video that went on. So we're getting to Porirua. So Porirua and its unmaking. Right, so to this end, you know, I'm kind of moving from a really simple question here to think through the complexity that is Porirua. So this question is, what happens to cities when the earth is abstracted, when soil is transformed and deposited at earth? So to think from this premise, firstly, I'll just look at earth. What is earth? The substance of land and surface, or also defined as a self-regulating organism, if you follow the kind of Gaia principles. Dirt, filthy or soiling substance, mud, dust or grime, or something worthless. So what I'm suggesting that there is, through the processes of urban development, there is an abstraction that occurs here, and this abstraction is what concerns me. And that's why I'm calling it kind of an unmaking. It's like a changing the character of, or an undoing, and in some senses a destroying. So unmaking one, and what I've done is actually cast these unmakings across 7, and so I'm going to sort of fly through these kind of, you know, without giving, I'm not concerned about giving full historical account or any correct chronology or so forth here. What I'm interested in doing is foregrounding this kind of the unmaking of place. So there we can see Governor George Grey in the background there. And one of the primary unmakings in this period was here's the initial plan, 1841 plan of Porirua, showing the initial allotment that on the flatland closest to the harbour and over the estuarine kind of area that was Kenepuru Stream. The straightening here of roads and the lot layouts. So that was the original plan for Porirua. What's so significant here is the illegal imprisonment of Te Raukaha in 1846, and the installation of troops here in Fort Parramatta at the most sort of strategic part on harbour. And during this time, the imprisonment of Te Raukaha was the unlawful purchase of Ngāti Toa lands in 1847. This third thing that's really significant about this phase of unmaking that I've called possess and strip is the beginning or the initiation of an absolutely radical deforestation project, which has led to multiple concerns. The second unmaking is I'm calling parcel and occupy. And now this is prompted in part by the Public Works Act that provided the Crown the authority to acquire land for public works. There was a survey done, a little bit like what's been done here recently in New Zealand with the urban development capacity, or housing capacity studies that have been done right across the country. In the 30s, I think it was the 30s, there was a study done across the country, and they recognised that a whole lot more housing was required. Now, there were many different sites where public housing was installed, but Porirua was by far the largest, and primarily it was the cheapest. And the reasons for that might be obvious from my previous comments. So there was significant land taken from Ngāti Toa, and right through from the 50s and the 60s, where it was continued to be appropriated. Now there was a rhetoric to this ambition from the government that was sort of pushing ahead with these housing projects based on sort of garden city ideals. But as it turned out, the quality of the houses got less and less as they moved into the 50s and 60s, with fibrillite and so forth being used, no longer the kind of hardwood timbers of the state houses of the 30s. And the other factor that occurred here was around the same time there was development in earthworks technologies, allowing for a greater sort of flattening of the earth and the movement of earth into the harbour area. One further factor at this time was that Ngāti Toa's objections were not acted upon, their objections to land as well, so also their objections to their loss of fishing rights. And that's in the 60s. So these are earlier ones from the 50s in Elsdon, and this is in Ascot Park. And so the extensive earthworks there just seem to become, rather kind of commonplace. So unmaking 3, cut, fill and contain. This is primarily around the original plan around the kind of the loss of Main Street, really, and the straightening of the Kinepuru Harbour. So in this kind of period, if we can see there's the straightened Kinepuru stream now, and then we can see it just off Elsdon there, straightened in the 50s. And in this image here, you can see, if I got a pointer, can you see that? We can see the straightened section here, but we can still see the estuarine condition at the kind of edge condition there of Kinepuru stream as it enters in the Oniporo Basin, that it's still intact. So this here you can see how the stream itself would have wound all the way up the valley, but at this point it becomes straightened, and as we know what comes after that. So hang on, I've lost my pages here. Haven't put numbers on my pages. Right, so my concern with this one is that there was a demolishing of the kind of historic, colonial historic part of Porirua. So as well as a kind of straightening of the stream corridor there. And this is by the 70s, this is expanded out, and the landfill has come in up to this point here. So nothing we really don't know about, other than there was multiple resistance to this particular plan to expand the harbour here, expand the town centre here, to take away the housing and so forth that was already existing. In fact, the plan, it took 13 years for the plan to kind of get instigated, and it wasn't until 1960 that it kind of went ahead, and then the mall was then built, over 100 lots and car parks, and then also in 1992 they expanded the mall again. And so this is in the 70s here, where you can still see this fair bit of open space, but Todd plants there in the top. And this is in the 2000s here. And in the background, you can see the Atrium. Check the time. Oh, okay. Now this fourth one is unmaking, is flatten and smooth. And so this one here really speaks for itself. There we can see Titahi Bay Road and what the making of Titahi Bay Road, and the massive benching that went into producing this Todd plant here. That image there being, most telling. Fifth, extend and sever, which is around the infrastructure and broadening and widening of the motorway corridor and the train corridor. It's in the 80s, they're still broadening it. The sixth is bench, batter and individualise. And this is where private speculation kind of begins to take over with 1,300 hectares of farmland from Whitby, and then 246 hectares in 2004 from the Atrium division development. Now, my concern about these is primarily around the development logic that underpins these forms of development. They require flat land for their I'll call them built, spatial products, their houses, their prefigured houses. So rather than build the housing to suit the terrain, they change the terrain to suit the housing. And this practice continues today. So if we fly through Aotea here and see all the changes over time. The final one is called Cut and Divide, and that is the rather magnificent but alarmingly frightening changes that have taken place with Transmission Gully. Now, none of these need explaining in terms of sedimentation, fallout in the harbours, etc., etc. So my point is really, oh, I've got a poem. Obviously we're way out of time here, but I'll just quickly finish, shall I? Is that all right? Okay, so this is for Atrium. Atrium being this area here in the top there, the subdivision. Atrium. It was the eye that was open and passing, the mediocrity of capital, plundered as sensation, where strip searched, piled and flattened, feet walked your bare-assed puki-puki. You could say that form is a learning, but what you thought were dark tales of illumination were bristles from your shaving. Touch is really an unstable compound. I want to rest a while to understand your silence, nested among the flesh of soft translucent sounds, fallen from your lips as vestiges of someone's breathing. That's an abridged piece given. I'm out of time. So to conclude, what happens to cities when the earth is abstracted, when soil is transformed and deposited as dirt? Well, this line here speaks for itself. But just to finish off, this talk was primarily prompted by my experience of Porirua's urban space and form. And I've run a few design studios and I supervised master's research in Porirua and also lived in Parramatta for 2 years. So during this time and in the context of proposed growth and spatial planning provisions, I've experienced the asymmetries and play in Porirua in various ways. Now, I don't want to conclude by enclosing Porirua with any definition or identification of solution. It appears to me that Porirua is frequently an object of study, and this objectification is something I'd like to resist. So I hope it's apparent that I'm not interested in the sort of techno-science side of the conversation here. I want to more open up what I've experienced and understood and understand as to why Porirua presents as less a city and more as a collection of public and speculative projects, and most importantly, projects built upon Ngāti Toa's dispossession. And I think this is acutely felt, even if you don't know the history. So my method here has been less analytically descriptive and more performative, where I also work backwards from the lens of what I'll call the urban blind spot, or the earth. So ubiquitous it seems as the practice of radical earthworks that very few seem to notice. And with this extreme visibility, yet the invisibility of soil as undervalued as dirt or homogeneous filler, I'd like to say that surely that's enough. Now, we all understand this general motivation of the urban development policy statement and housing capacity requirements to ensure territorial authorities to plan for projected growth in population. Yet, could we respond to the multifaceted issues of urban space form and growth in ways that do not presume a finite game, or one predetermined by using practices that hold the earth with such disregard? Issues of urban growth in Porirua at least appear to be simplified and reduced to a concern of housing. So how do we hold a space for the earth, the intrinsic common, in this equation without the domination of possession? So sorry to kind of race screamingly through that. I'll leave it there and really like to hear a couple of questions.
Yeah, thank you, Hannah. That was fantastic, even though you had to race at the end. But really great. Thank you. Any questions?
Or thoughts?
Hannah, just in terms of ecological practice, if you like, this kind of forever reshaping is such a concern, yet it seems to me that economics is the thing behind it, and particularly the kind of extractive economics where the land is regarded as just another mechanism to extract capital some way. Yeah, so it's a beautiful window that you've held up to that, a beautiful window of a horrendous practice. Yeah, do you have any suggestions, you know, having been reflecting on ecological practices myself? Yeah.
Well, I mean, it is a difficult one, isn't it? Because it cuts to the kind of core of the kind of underpinning logic of what we could say makes the world go round in terms of commerce. That, you know, property is at its kind of base, and the possession or property as a kind of individualized possession to me seems deeply problematic, and not something I can kind of tackle in any great way. However, the recent studio I undertook with students, that the proposition to them was to develop in the Northern Growth Corridor, the plot that's called Plimerton Farm, to develop that or find a way of developing that without private property ownership. And in that sense, it's drawing on, you know, the long traditions of commoning that have come across many different traditions and ethnicities in different ways. And then we see it here, of course, in iwi lands, you know, Papakainga and so on in one particular format. And I think we need to find other ways of living.
Yeah, completely. Shared ownership seems to me to be a really important way forward, including of both housing and land.
Any further questions?
Kia ora. Hi, Hannah.
Hey, Florence.
Hi, everyone. I've got a question. I mean, it's pretty shocking when you put it like that. I drive past every day and see it, but kind of that's another. I find it quite hard hitting, actually, how badly it seems to be treated. I just wonder if you think, is Porirua special? Has it been specially treated? Has it been treated differently to other places? And if so, why? And are there other places that have had that similar kind of treatment? And, you know, are there similar causes? Are there things that lead to it? Is it proximity to Wellington, etc.? Yeah,
I know. I think it's an extreme version of things that have happened elsewhere, but I do think it's a special case in that it's extreme. And I think the reasons for that are, well, let's just say first, I can see a parallel or some analogy with parts of South Auckland. And, you know, that's obvious that we can sort of see that areas where there've been high dependency on what was state housing. In Porirua at one time, it was up at 70%. Areas where there have been new immigrants or people haven't been, you know, dwelt on the earth for quite a long time, for very long, or dwelt on that particular earth. And also areas where there's been, which covers most of New Zealand, where there's been kind of a horrendous and very recent confiscations of land from mana whenua or tangata whenua. So I think you bring those things together. The land is also, you know, within 20 kilometres from Wellington. It's, you know, was deemed to be, you know, it's one of the commuter suburbs. So it doesn't get any resource put it in, so it doesn't kind of build. So I think there are a lot of factors that contribute to it. But as a real newcomer, I'm hesitant to kind of form anything conclusive about that, other than say what it feels like. And you can actually, you feel, in my experience of the place, there is almost like there's a tiredness in terms of, well, there's sort of a lack of momentum around claiming place and voice. And I'm sure that without a doubt, there's some really strong communities, and I'm not effacing those. But as a city, it just does not feel like it's got enough critical mass to voice itself. So, yeah.
Apparently, the council really struggles to get rates because everyone has business outside of town and or moves outside of town and then comes back in. Sort of. Sorry, Sophie, you had your hand up.
Hey, kia ora, Hannah. Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yep. I just think it's an awesome beginning of what could be a really stunning, you know, publication. And as you know, 5 years ago, we did a big project out in Porirua, and I began to hear some of these narratives, and it feels like to me you're slightly avoiding working alongside Ngāti Toa or whoever else you need to, maybe some of the Pacifica communities, because this will be such a stunning frame to offer. And, you know, I mean, there are some really key aspects to your narrative, which I think it made richer by adding in
Oh, lost you.
Created all they called it Tikasa in 1880. That allowed it raw sewage to come.
We only got some of that. Sorry, Sophie.
Yeah, sorry, Sophie. I mean, it's the issue.
Oh, no, sure. So there's some massive.
Yes, lost you there, Sophie. Sorry, okay. But I mean, the issue, there's so many issues there that it's. I've tried to keep this talk totally, mainly focus as much as I could on the soil itself and kind of make that the kind of locus of the conversation, just like that was the blind spot. But yeah, because as soon as you start extrapolating, there is the sewage and there is the runoff and there's the flooding, and it just gets bigger and bigger. And the thing, and it relates to what Florence was saying, is that what is extraordinary to me is that so many of the big organisations continue to breach their environmental conditions and they just pay the fine. So Transmission Gully, it took the Chamber of Commerce to write a letter to say they couldn't believe that still the Transmission Gully were breaching their runoff conditions somehow, and they were just paying the abatement notices of $750 each.
Wow.
And even though they had underestimated 50% of the amount of earth moving required for Transmission Gully, and no one's made a fuss about it. And that took the Chamber of Commerce to say that. And things like the Wellington Water, their continual discharge, they pay the fine. So that's what just staggers me. It's like, and the earth movings is another one. There's all these things occurring, and it's like, why is no one screaming? It's just like they're so tired of it. But yeah, I'd like to talk to you more about that because I only caught fragments of what you were saying.
Sure.
Hannah, it would be really wonderful to see a future-focused studio that looks at a similar scale of housing redevelopment as the historical ones you highlight, but done in a leading way in terms of the ecologies of the way that it would happen, and then pitched as a way to demonstrate actually this is not the only way these things can occur. Yeah.
For sure. Cool. I'd love to chat longer, but I've already gone over time, and I teach at 22.
Yeah. No, thank you very much, Hannah, and thanks everyone for joining us. It was fantastic.
Yeah, really appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Kia ora.